2, 1.
You are on the cutting edge with Dr. Lee Pierson, Dr. Robert Stubblefield, and Steve Richins. Our guest today, Trent Fowler, is back, the machine learning technologist, the co-host of the Technorati podcast, and also an author of a book I can't think of at the moment, but we're going to discuss ChatGPT 4. I guess it doesn't matter too much. It's just chatbots in general. And I guess I'll turn it over to Lee. Did I miss anything?
No, I think that's good. I mean, our topic is not just chatbot, but I guess that's the focus, is the idea of, where are we with respect to what's called artificial general intelligence? And are these GPT AIs, whatever GPTX, whether it's 3, 4, 5, or 27, are we getting closer to artificial general intelligence? And which I think that's an important issue. Now, one of the issues there is what's meant by artificial general intelligence. What is that? And maybe that's a good point at which for me to hand the ball off to Trent, our machine learning engineer. And what else do you call yourself, Trent? Do you call yourself a futurist? Or what? How would you describe yourself, in 1 or 2 words?
Yeah, I do sometimes call myself a futurist. And yes, I'm a machine learning engineer and data scientist, and I co-host the Futurati podcast. So futurist, author, engineer, and podcast co-host.
Man of many hats. Okay, so what can you tell? First of all, can you say something about, maybe you're the man to give us a little orientation to what these GPT systems are doing, and then maybe a little bit about AGI. Or I don't know. You can say anything you want, but those are what I'm going to suggest. So go ahead and do something.
Yeah, happily. So I'll do something. That's what I was brought here to do. Yeah. So yeah. I thought,
and then we'll have a discussion later. But we're going to listen to you for a while.
For sure. So the way I was hoping to proceed is I'm happy to say a little bit about the GPT systems, how they're trained and how they work internally. And then I wanted to survey what, in my view, are 4 major epistemological problems with trying to assess whether or not they're generally intelligent systems.
Excellent.
So
excellent.
Yeah, I thought that could maybe frame the discussion, and then we can ideally get into some of the meatier topics around free will, consciousness, and their relationship to intelligence, because I think that if objectivism is going to make a contribution to this debate, that's probably where it's going to be. And I think that's all worth getting into. So very briefly, I will just adumbrate at a high level the way these systems work and they're trained. I didn't really prepare anything for that, but I can just sort of rattle it off, I think. So the GPT systems, GPT stands for Generative Pre-trained Transformer Model. That tells you a fair bit, if you understand the lingo, about what you're actually dealing with. So these are enormously large and complex neural network models that have been trained to generate fresh outputs on the other side. And not all models do. So you can have a predictive model that does not output a lot of text. Maybe it just classifies images of cats and separates them from images of dogs. There's lots of ways you can handle this sort of thing. What distinguishes generative algorithms is that their purpose is to generate something new, whether that's code, music, images, or something like that. And that distinguishes it from a regression algorithm or a classification algorithm or something like that. The way they are trained is they are fed enormous quantities of data, generally text data, although it could be images, it could be music, it could be code, it could be various other things. And they learn through this just internal process of iteratively updating the parameters to successively do better and better at outputting text. And this is achieved with a technique called self-supervised learning. So what you will do with a model like GPT is feed it enormous amounts of the internet, for example, and it will look at, let's say for the sake of argument, 80% of a paragraph, and then it will try to predict what the other 20% is. And at first, all the internal parameters are initialized randomly. And so it's just a bunch of gobbledygook in there. And so what you get on the outside of it is a bunch of gobbledygook. It's awful. And then it uses gradient descent to tune those parameters. And sometimes I liken it to having an enormous control board with thousands of knobs, and each one gets turned just a little bit. And then the output gets a little bit better. It's a little bit closer to what it's looking at. And this goes on and on and on, sometimes for weeks or months. And what you get at the end of it is something like GPT-4 that is able to output sonnets, that's able to output the Sermon on the Mount in the style of Ayn Rand, or what have you, plays, music, code, fresh sorts of things like that. And I believe ChatGPT is a couple of months old now. I think it came out in February, and it has just ignited a firestorm of speculation and controversy and commentary and all sorts of other things. People think it's going to be the end of the world. People think that it's basically a toy. It's a stochastic parrot. Well, incidentally, I take some of those. I take AI risk fairly seriously. I'm not afraid of ChatGPT, but I do think there are reasons to worry about artificial general intelligence, which we can get into if you like. But it has really set things on fire, and it has made artificial intelligence a real thing in the popular imagination for what I take to be maybe the first time, possibly when Lee Sedol lost to AlphaZero, or it was AlphaGo. When he lost to AlphaGo, that might have been a comparable moment. But this was the first time millions and millions of people have been able to play with a system like this, and they're asking themselves real questions about whether or not they'll have jobs next year, whether or not their lives will change forever, and it just all sorts of things have happened as a result. We've had the first suicide. A guy interacted with one of these models for a couple of weeks and then killed himself. So lots of ethical issues to get into. So hopefully that context is helpful and it frames it a little bit. I wanted to talk somewhat about the epistemological problems which obtain in trying to evaluate whether or not these things are general intelligences. And the way I see it, we have four broad problems. The first problem is that we don't actually know what data GPT-4 has been trained on. We know it's a lot of data, and we know it's textual data. We know it's probably crawled from the internet, but we don't actually know what's in the training set. So if you ask me, well, does it have, cookbook recipes in Albanian or something like that? I couldn't tell you. There's no way for me to audit that and tell. And the reason that redounds to the question of whether or not it's generally intelligent is because one of the ways we would tell if an algorithm, or even a human for that matter, is generally intelligent is the extent to which it can do something which is unlike anything it's ever seen before. So if you'll permit me just a brief digression, I have a thought experiment which I think illuminates this pretty well. So if you imagine that you have two language models, language model A and language model B, and they are both tasked with generating Python code, I think that you can more accurately claim that the language model, which has never seen Python code before, but which is able to output Python code, is more generally intelligent than the one that is not able to do that has seen Python code before and is able to generate Python code on the basis of what it's seen. So if you imagine a language model that is trained on a tremendous amount of text data, but we can verify that there is no code in it, and I can ask it to produce code, and it's able to do so, I think that is stronger evidence of it being generally intelligent than a similar model which has seen code before. In the same way, you would draw a similar, I think, inference on the basis of human beings, right? So if you've got one person who studied a programming language and he's asked to learn a new programming language, that's not as impressive as a person who can learn a programming language from scratch in the same amount of time. So the fact that we don't have access to the training data makes it a little hard for us to infer or even to weigh the evidence pro and con as to whether or not these things are intelligent, unless that is you've got deep philosophical reasons for ruling out that it's generally intelligent, which I presume that you do, and I presume that we will get into. So that is the first epistemological issue. The second is that replication is very difficult with these things, both because they're tremendously sensitive to the prompts that are given to them. So if you change the wording just a little bit, that can dramatically change the output that you see downstream. And because they're stochastic, the machinery under the hood does not always output the same stream of text for the same input, right? So what that means is sometimes you'll have these papers where people will claim to have gotten GPT-4 to do these incredible things, right? It's able to plan your financial life. It's able to replace your therapist. It's made you happier. You've quit smoking, all these things, right? And it can sometimes be very difficult for people to evaluate those claims because they'll try the exact same experiments with the exact same prompts and won't get the same outputs. And so I think we need to consider carefully what it would mean to replicate results with something with a huge artifact that is stochastic. As you know, replicability is a gold standard in science. It's one of the basic ways we evaluate the validity of an experiment, and that's much harder when you're dealing with something that is fundamentally stochastic. Third, I would note that interpretability is very much in its infancy. So if you're dealing with something like a random forest or a very simple neural network like a multi-layer perceptron, it's got 5-10 layers. We've got some pretty good tools for figuring out what they're doing internally, but that is not at all the case when you're dealing with something that has 175 billion parameters, which GPT-4 does. the tooling we have to inspect the way these models work internally is incredibly primitive, especially compared to the capacities of these systems. And so if it were the case, I'm not saying it is, but if it were the case that they were forming primitive analogs of concepts, or they had some sort of rudimentary theory of mind, we'd have almost no way of knowing except by inspecting the outputs. And that just introduces a bevy of difficulties when it comes to trying to figure out whether or not these things are generally intelligent. And then finally, I would note that we don't have, to the best of my knowledge, anything like a general theory of intelligence or even deep learning and neural networks. So it is very, very difficult to bound the capability of near future systems. It's very hard for me to say what GPT-6 can and can't do, or GPT-7 can and can't do. And the further out you go, the more speculative all those claims become. So a lot of us have been very surprised at the power of GPT-3 and ChatGPT and what it's been able to do. And we were even more so surprised by GPT-4, which I don't know if you heard, but not only passed the bar exam, but passed in the top 90th percentile. So it's better than all but 10% of the applicants to law schools, which doesn't mean lawyers aren't going to have a job next week, because most of what a lawyer does is not answer LSAT questions. But I don't know many people who would have been able to look at GPT-3 and say, this thing, GPT-4, its successor, will be able to do X, Y, and Z, but not A, B, and C, right? It can do these things, but not these things. We don't have anything like a generative theory, which allows us to speculate in anything like an informed manner about what these things can do. And for that reason, I lean towards saying that GPT-4 is not generally intelligent. But there's no fact about intelligence or consciousness known to me which allows me to rule out categorically that an advanced enough system wouldn't be. GPT-10 with 2 quintillion parameters or something like this. I don't know. I don't have a mechanistic understanding of intelligence or consciousness, which allows me to say these things are not conscious and never can be. We have been continuously surprised by how powerful they are and what they have been able to do. And it's not obvious to me that some future version of the model in a decade's time will not be generally intelligent.
Okay, can we talk a little bit about that, or are you done for the moment? I know you got lots of things to say, Trent, but can we comment
please,
about this?
Let's get into it. Do it.
Yeah, because there's a lot in what you say, but there's some things that I would definitely disagree with in it. Now let's see. Okay. First of all, about the nature of the chat bots and GPT, whatever. I know the 4 is much better than 3, of course, because it's 4 rather than 3, and 5 will be better than 4, and presumably so on. But the question of now, okay, let me start with intelligence. Let's start with that. I hear this thing all the time from all kinds of smart people, not just you, Trent, but all other smart people, that we have no theory of intelligence. They complain. Well, first of all, there is some theory of intelligence. I wouldn't say it's all that good, but there's a whole history in psychology which these guys don't know about that bears in the problem. But more importantly than that, just as human beings, we know a lot more about intelligence than people are willing to admit. You know the difference between being smart and not being smart. There's a whole common sense level of knowledge that we have. We know that intelligence, whatever, okay, I don't have a precise definition, but we know it involves conceptual thinking, generalization. When people say artificial general intelligence, I say that's what intelligence would be. Intelligence is general by its nature. That's the view I would take on it. And it involves the ability to deal with abstractions, concepts, actually. And so from that standpoint, I would say, as far as I know, the AI systems at this point have no concepts whatsoever. I mean, zero. They're not based on concepts. They're based on statistics, not conceptual thinking, in the sense, for example, that Ayn Rand talks about it in Introduction to Objectivist Epistemology. They don't use that kind of methodology to come up with they don't have any concepts. When we talk about language processing, it's a little like many of the terms in the AI field. It's a little misleading. It doesn't deal with language. It deals with strings of text. There isn't those things which for human beings, a word is a symbol for a concept, and there is something in your mind that's a part of, really. It stands for and is a part of. That doesn't exist in the AI systems, as I understand it now. So it's much more mechanistic. The way Jim Hansen is a fellow on Harry Binswanger's list, gave me a nice description, or us description of the GPT systems. He says that what the program does, in essence, it takes what you type in as input and uses the neural network as a function in the mathematical sense, in order to generate an output mechanically, as it were, or as if by reflex. It's not done by, there is no thought process involved in it. So that's the first thing I'd start there, that there's something entirely different. And it's just a different category of process from an intellectual process. It's just a different sort of thing. Now, we know, let's get out of the way at the outset, that we know it does all kinds of amazing stuff. I am quite amazed. One thing that really amazes me is the ability to output grammatical, human, well-styled sentences that sound, like they're stylistically, done by somebody who knows how to write. That to me is quite amazing. I don't understand that coming from a process that aggregates a bunch of information and then just makes predictions word by word. I understand it's more or less word by word. Is that right, Trent? Isn't it?
It can be.
Predicts the next word and the next word and the next word, which it's amazing.
It's generally tokens, and you can think of a word as like a token, but that's not quite right. Sometimes there's subwords, so it might be like clusters of 3 letters and spaces, stuff like that, or sometimes they can even do sentences at a time. And I don't actually know for sure how they do it. So I'm not entirely sure how they do it. Sometimes you find that character level prediction actually works best, and sometimes you find that like half sentence chunks work best. So I couldn't speculate, but that's something their engineers know.
Either way, we're not dealing with concepts. We're not dealing with operations at the level of conceptual thought. It's something more or less. It doesn't really, I would say it's not in a real contact with the world. It has a lot of strings of text, and it's dealing with strings of text. So people will sometimes say that the mistakes they make, and of course they do make mistakes, they refer to these mistakes as hallucinations. And I would say that's a misuse of the term, because you can't hallucinate unless you have actual valid contact. Hallucination is a concept formed in distinction to valid perception or valid awareness. And to the machine, there's no distinction. It just has a bunch of text. It doesn't distinguish between what's true and false. It doesn't have the mechanism for distinguishing true and false. And that's where we come to this another epistemological point, which is that's why I'm suggesting that you have a look at what Dr. Peikoff had to say. There are many other sources of this argument, but there's an argument which I think is right, that deterministic systems, by their nature, any deterministic system, so any algorithm, and even, by the way, throwing in something stochastic doesn't help. It just makes things worse, actually. Any deterministic system cannot have validated knowledge, or actually probably a better way of putting it is a deterministic system cannot be objective. It is under the control of whatever causal factors happen to be operating. So what you get is the result of those causal factors, whether or not they have any relation to truth. So I guess there would be one possible deterministic system that could be considered to be objective. And that would be if you had a program, if you had the ultimate program that covered every possible contingency in the universe and could not make any mistakes whatsoever. I think maybe that program could be considered to be objective. If you had, of course, we don't have that program. Either
GPT-6.
Okay, somewhere down the line, but I don't think we're even close to that particular program. And otherwise, knowledge, or at least conceptual knowledge, is not possible to a deterministic entity. I think if examples might make this as kind of an abstract argument. So some examples. So if for example, Marxism were the case, our beliefs would be determined by our socioeconomic, our economic class situation, not by truth. If psychoanalysis were true, Freud's theory, our beliefs would be determined by our early toilet training and other such things, not by the truth of the statements. Or if behaviorism were true, our beliefs would be the result of past reinforcements And of course, reinforcement learning is big now in AI.
Mhm.
But anyway, our beliefs will be determined by those past reinforcements without any regard to whether they have anything to do with being true or false. And I think the systems have no possibility of dealing at the level of true and false, of being objective, precisely because they're deterministic. No matter how good they get, unless again I would make the possible exception of if it were an ultimate system, if it were a program that mechanistically could cover every possible contingency that could ever happen anywhere in the universe. And if let me know if you have that program. So that's one other thing I wanted to mention now. And I've got a lot of things, but I shouldn't be talking monopolizing here so much. But I wanted to say one other thing about do a little epistemological joust with you on ruling out. You say you can't rule out the possibility that the machines can become conscious. I would say that, if you'll forgive me, Trent, that's the wrong epistemological approach. You don't prove negatives. You don't rule things out. You advance possibility based on positive evidence. So what I would want to see is I don't want to worry about ruling out everything that's wrong that could be false. I want positive evidence for what's possible, and I see no positive evidence whatsoever for the possibility of conceptual thought, which I would say is essential to actual intelligence in the current machines. They remind me of what the philosopher Ewart Dreyfus said, in what computers can't do, or maybe the second edition, I don't remember which one, where he says,
can't do.
Yeah, what computers still can't do. This is a pretty good book, actually. It's at least interesting book. And one of the things he said, as I remember, was saying that that some of the progress that people make towards intelligence or consciousness or conceptual knowledge are a whole lot like saying that when you climb a tree, you're getting closer to the moon. It's really not genuine. So I think that's still applicable, even though the progress made is certainly quite, or the things that AI systems can do are, I concede, are quite amazing. I've conceded that ever since they started beating me at chess, which has been a while now. So I concede that point, but it's not doing it by intelligence. It's showing that there are a whole lot of things you can do that don't require intelligence. And let me make one. I'm going to make one other point, at least, before I forget it. I think what these systems are like, and this is a metaphor, is they're like people that are second-handed. You're familiar with the fountainhead, Trent, aren't you?
Of course, yeah.
Well, the big issue in the fountainhead is first-handedness versus second-handedness. And the first-handed are the independent thinkers, and they produce the new ideas, and they show independent judgment. I say these systems metaphorically, because it's not literally like all of these, right? So many of these concepts, it doesn't literally apply, but metaphorically, they're all second-handed. They're taking basically a sort of a consensus from all the information that they collate and statistically analyze, and come up with something on that basis, rather than making an independent judgment. They're totally based on what has been already said in the internet. So they're second-handed in that sense. Now that doesn't mean they're useless. I mean, Peter Keating is pretty useless, I guess. But even he's not totally necessarily useless. And they're not evil like Ellsworth Toohey. That's another example of second-handedness, because they don't have consciousness and free will. So they're not either of those things. But they're metaphorically something like second-handed. And also, I would say metaphorically, maybe a little more than metaphorically, you could say that these systems are something like having an external subconscious, an extra subconscious. But to be intelligent, an intelligent mind, an actual mind, a form of intelligence, you need both consciousness and a subconscious. You need both of those things. So therefore, to wrap this up, I would say that we're not getting, in one sense, we're not getting closer to artificial general intelligence at all, because these things actually have zero actual intelligence. That's one way of looking at it. On the other hand, I would say this much, that if we can figure out how to combine the human being who is conscious with the external subconscious, and that's what in chess they're called centaurs when they do that. Centaurs can do amazing things. And I think you could say that I think you could properly say that a centaur is a form of artificial general intelligence, and maybe even now is a form of artificial intelligence and could be improved in the future. But that requires a human being as necessarily. And furthermore, I think you have to make sure that the human being is the boss. The top half of the centaur runs the bottom half. And if you do that, that gets rid of all the problems, the possible problems that our AIs will take over the world and kill us all and turn us into slaves or any of that stuff. If you make sure that you have a proper centaur, there is no worry. They are not agents themselves. They don't have free will. And you can say, well, of course, if someday somebody figures out how to give a machine consciousness and free will, then we have a different game altogether. But I would say at this point, nobody has even the slightest idea of how to do that, nor has anyone made even the slightest progress, because the computers do not necessarily, there's no reason to believe. I'm not saying I can rule it out, but that's not my way of looking at things. The computers, I have no reason to believe that the computers have any ability to duplicate whatever the causal powers of a human organism are that make it possible to generate consciousness and free will, which we don't know what those are, but I don't have any reason at all to think that any of those causal powers exist in a computer. Nor do I have any reason to even think that we can at this point we have no way to make it how should I put this, simulate life. I mean, conscious intelligent beings are living beings, and these devices are not living beings, and that's another thing that you have to incorporate. And that one I can see more possibility of, but I really find the free will issue to be the biggest sticking point. I don't see any possibility of that happening by current means. I better stop there while I'm still ahead. I'll quit while I'm ahead.
All right. Yeah. Well, so let's get into it.
Bob wants to say something, but let's let Trent. Maybe let Trent rejoin a little bit, and then Bob can jump in, and we'll just jump all over you.
Okay, it sounds good. Yeah. So let's. I'll try to take it in order as best I can reconstruct it. So to begin with, you note that we have intuitive common sense levels of understanding of intelligence. I completely agree. I think that's right. But it's important to note as well that those can lead us astray if we don't have anything more formal or anything more pinned down. I mean, you had hysteria a couple of months ago, maybe it was last year, where they were claiming that one of these Google models was sentient because it said it was, and we're not very well equipped for thinking carefully about machines that are outputting text that is completely indistinguishable from a human. I mean, if I didn't see the ChatGPT interface, I wouldn't know it wasn't a person, except on those rare occasions when it hallucinates or does something really goofy. And people can be misled by those intuitions. So I think that speaks to the need for a better mechanistic understanding of intelligence, or at least something that will allow us to bound the capabilities or reason more rigorously about what's going on internally in an intelligent system. And remark one way or another whether or not we think GPT qualifies. You said that they are deterministic, or there's some stochasticity, and therefore they are not able to form concepts in the way that humans are. I'm sympathetic to that view. I am sympathetic to that view. I think that's in part a question for interpretability, because it's actually not clear to me that they're not forming rudimentary concepts. And I mean very rudimentary, right? Or at least perhaps not concepts, but something that begin to look like the start of one. So for some of these systems, like a deep convolutional neural network, we can sometimes visualize what different layers are focusing in on, and sometimes they're focusing on curves or edges. They're focusing in on spaces. Like sometimes we can see individual neurons activate in specific patterns, which begin to look kind of like concepts. They always activate when you're talking about a city. They always activate when you're talking about capital cities. They always activate when you're talking about human beings. Now, that's not a concept, right? I mean, this is not an abstraction over a family of concretes where you're omitting the measurements. It's not like a human concept, but it's not obvious to me that that's not the beginning of one. I mean, I'm not confident that that wouldn't correspond to a rudimentary concept in a lower life form, maybe a dog or a cat. Perhaps not that high, but and I know you don't like this formulation, but I can't rule out the possibility that a more advanced system wouldn't stumble upon those specific things. And this is why I believe that we should complete the project that Rand was undertaking later in her life, where she was looking at the relationship between calculus and algebra, concept formation, and neuroscience. She wanted to investigate that more completely. I think that's a worthwhile project and something that somebody somewhere should be dealing with. If I had the time, maybe I would do it myself, but alas, I don't. So I agree that concept formation is definitely out of reach of this current iteration of systems, but it's not obvious to me that future versions couldn't be doing something like that. And we do have, in fact, examples of the building blocks of at least maybe perceptual concepts. I don't know if that's a valid formulation in the way you think about these things, but when you have the one layer that's focusing on, like I said, curves, you've got another that's focusing on edges or maybe corners, you've got one that's looking at faces that activate in these systemic patterns when they're looking at a particular feature of reality. Am I sure that at 100 trillion parameters, GPT-4 wouldn't be, or GPT-10 wouldn't be doing something kind of similar with higher level concepts? It's not obvious to me that they wouldn't. And you can find, and I'm not going to be able to reproduce this off the top of my head, but I was listening to a podcast not long ago where they were going through this exact thing. They were saying, are there concepts in these systems? And they walked through some simple examples of things I mentioned, like particular neurons that fire when you're talking about a city. Just having a characteristic firing pattern of neurons, I don't think constitutes a concept. But again, do you have the beginnings of one? I'm not sure that you don't, and I'm not sure that a more advanced system wouldn't. And in order to think more clearly about that, I think you'd need a better understanding of precisely the steps that occur in concept formation at a neurological level, or in at least a specification, what you might look for in a computer system or a deep learning system that would correspond to that would allow you to say, yes, it is, or no, it's not. Let's see. Positive evidence, right? So, I mean, this is necessarily pretty murky. I don't disagree with your epistemological jousting that you can't go through your life proving negatives, right? I mean, that's just not how we structure a search for truth. Nevertheless, I think that we can look at a high level at the human brain and its constituent parts, and we can look at these neural network systems. And again, it's not obvious to me that one of them at sufficient size couldn't approximate the functioning of the human brain. There's nothing magical happening at the level of neurons. Obviously, the mesoscale organizations of these neurons are incredibly complex and probably, I'm sure, dwarf anything that we see in a neural network. But, if you had something with 100 trillion parameters and it trained for a year and it took $5 billion, can we categorically rule out that there wouldn't be similar structures in these sorts of things? I think that's a question for interpretability, and we need to do a lot more work on that front. So I couldn't tell you precisely at what point in the human brain free will emerges, or like if you cut the brain in half, is it still there? Probably not. If you have 150,000 neurons, is free will present? Probably not consciousness either. But at some point in the development of that system, those capacities come online, and they're just complex adaptive systems which self-organize through a process of embryology that we understand fairly well. They interface with the world, they learn concepts in these ways. I don't know that you would actually need to understand those things top to bottom in order to grow a system in a lab that does something similar. I mean, it's not as though evolution was setting out to program free will, and program's not the right word there, but to imbue a system with free will, consciousness, agency, and all the rest. And yet that emerged out of an optimization process that, to my eye, does not look all that different from what we're doing in training these GPT systems. Now, we plausibly could be quite a long way away from that, but I don't know that we would know that for sure. I don't know that we would know if we were getting close. And if we cross that threshold, I don't know that we would recognize that, because we don't have good theories of how those things work in the brain, what gives rise to them. And we don't have the tools we need to inspect the internals of a complex neural network like GPT-4 in order to say yes or no, this is happening, or it's not. A lot of work needs to be done in that way. I think you're right about the centaurs. I'm not confident that the reign of the centaurs will be all that long. I guess it's anybody's guess. So right now, those systems obviously so human computer hybrid systems do outperform humans alone or machines alone. I don't think that there's any reason to believe that will be the case forever. We could get into why. So there's the possibility of something like recursive self-improvement. There's the possibility of just trivial upgrades to the way these systems function with more compute or with more memory, all of which are not options which humans or centaurs can avail themselves of in the same way. And yeah, for various reasons, I think that the ceiling on intelligence, I suspect, is much higher than what human beings are capable of. And I see no reason to think that an artificial system couldn't be vastly smarter than a human being or a human machine hybrid at some point in the future, and agentive in the same way, again, because agency and volition are not magical. That doesn't mean that they're easy to arrive at, that, maybe you could show me a proof that a deep learning system could never achieve them. But I go back to this a lot, and I think it's a compelling point that human beings, human general intelligence, human agency, all emerged out of an optimization process, natural selection. And there's no reason to think that something similar couldn't give rise to analogous capacities in an artificial system. Maybe that doesn't look anything like training through gradient descent. I mean, plausibly not. I could be convinced of that, but the positive evidence I'm seeing so far does not give me a lot of confidence that that would be the case. I would need to see a lot more. So, or at least, rigorous arguments and pinned down definitions of what those terms mean, mechanistic understanding of what gives rise to them, and reasons to believe that that can't emerge in a system, however complex, like GPT-4. So I could be convinced of that, but I don't see much reason to believe that's the case now.
Very good.
So,
I have a lot of things to say, but I better let Steve and Bob in first, and then I'm going to try to focus. I think
Let's go, guys.
Go ahead, Steve, and then Bob. Steve and Bob are going to jump in here, I'm sure.
Trent, you keep saying that you don't know if you can rule this out, and that's a deductive process. And intelligence and free will are going to be induced into reality. So I don't know if that is completely right, but when you are looking to rule something out, then you're not on track, you're not inducing. And this is new knowledge, so it's necessarily going to have that flavor of it's going to be induced. And one thing I wanted to say about Bob before he starts, I didn't know that his PhD thesis was on artificial intelligence, and so he's quite qualified on this topic. So I'm going to let him talk about this next. But I think when he did his PhD thesis, there was an AI winter, and now we have a spring or whatever you may call it.
We're calling it a summer.
Well, I'm not nearly as qualified as Steve implied, because my PhD thesis was in 1967, so I'm out of date. We use threshold devices. I use threshold devices, but rather than billions or trillions, there were 10. So you can imagine how well my pattern recognition thing worked. The Air Force gave my PhD thesis advisor the contract anyway, and I got a PhD anyway. So it was a success in a different dimension.
Yeah.
I want to point out that I think of the machine learning devices that exist so far as being more analogous to the subconscious than to the conscious. They have just as much intelligence. Well, they approximate the intelligence of a subconscious as opposed to the intelligence of a conscious being. In particular, a conscious being's first hint of knowledge is at the perceptual level. So if you don't have a perceptual contact with reality, you're not really going to have the equivalent of a subconscious.
Okay.
So that's one point I want to make. A second point I want to make is that although these things are dealing with words that to us are concepts, if you take the best, most I guess good or forgiving think of what these machines are doing, they're manipulating concepts. They're actually manipulating tokens that we recognize as concepts. Given that they have no direct contact with reality, they are equivalent to rationalists. That is, they're manipulating concepts without contact with reality. So you really got to get perception in there. And I think that means you have to have consciousness, and I think that means you have to have life. You can simulate a lot of that, but so far you're very far away from that. But let me make some suggestions that might improve on that nonetheless. We know that there are axioms. There's no such thing as an axiom in any of these devices. There's things that are sort of equivalent to it in some ways. Like I understand that there's a veto power on such things as coming out. I don't know what it is, but like well, a poor man's version of woke, maybe, that they're not allowed to violate that. But at any rate, I would think that trying to program axiomatic knowledge, the equivalent of that, into these devices would be a major step forward in simulating a well-ordered subconscious. Let me stop at that point right for now.
No, I think that's all very good. And
Yep.
Steve, I'm very sympathetic to your objection that this is not inductive. I think a fresh inductive look at all these things would be enormously valuable. And as I've said before, if I had but the time and the money, then that's probably what I would be doing. I'd be taking Dr. Binswanger's courses and trying to do exactly that. I just don't right now. So I think someone should do that. If no one gets around to it in a year, maybe I'll do it. But I think you're right. So plausibly, in the process of inducing a definition of an intelligence or fresh concepts of consciousness and free will, maybe all these fears about GPT-4 and its future conscious states go away. That's possible. I can't rule that out to use that phrase. So I'll let you know. We'll have to do another one when I get around to doing that. But I don't think that's wrong. I'm not really sure where that will lead, having not done it yet. To Bob, to your point, you're right. They don't have any contact with reality, and for various reasons, that's problematic. I don't know how far away that would be. So right now, they are working on integrating these systems into robotics. It surely doesn't seem like it would be all that hard to hook them up with actuators or sensors, which are able to perceive, if you want to use that word, or at least, have their sensors impinged upon by external inputs, whatever you want to say it. So there would not be a consciousness there, presumably. But I think it's an open question as to whether or not perception requires consciousness. I mean, you could make that argument if you want, but I mean, surely these sensors, there's a rich tradition, as you surely must know, in getting robots to interface with the world and to reason about what they see, and a lot of progress is being made in that. So, I don't know that if you hooked up a deep learning system to a Boston Dynamics robot, you wouldn't have kind of the rudiments of what you'd need there. And, as to the question about axiomatic concepts, my understanding is from OPAR is that axiomatic concepts aren't proven. They are inherent in every act of perception and presupposed by all further acts of perception and any action or act of cognition. And so if it was able to perceive at all, then existence, identity, and consciousness would have to in some way be baked into its knowledge of the world. It's, there is something of which I am aware, and that gets you all three concepts. And if you've got a system that's doing anything like perception, that would have to be in there. Whether or not it can reason about it is a different question, but it took thousands of years for humans to do so, as well.
Yeah, I would suggest that you would get a lot more progress towards looking intelligent if before you worry about perceiving, you worry about truth. That is, there are some known axioms, and none of these devices know those axioms. None of these
or anything else.
None of these devices check one thing against those axioms.
Well, a lot of humans don't.
I wouldn't expect them to learn those axioms without perception. But go ahead and bypass that step for now, and
Well,
just
but they're there, right?
check what it comes against axioms, and you'd have a massive improvement. I played around with the Bard and one of these chat things, and that's where I said, God, those things are rationalists. They're not in touch with reality at all. I tried to get it to give me a history of economics, the economic thought, and the progress, and things went wrong and things were right, and so on. And it was the most soft soap, giving every school of economics equal credit for being right, and winding up with a comment at the end. Of course, there's something of value in each of these, you know. It's
Second-handedness.
yeah.
By the way, Trent, I wanted to, you pushed one of my little buttons there with that thing about the humans have the same problem. I've seen this repeated many times about biases. Oh, humans have biases too. What this totally overlooks, that all the people that make that point just don't grasp at all, is that, yeah, sure, humans have biases, but they have free will. And therefore they're able, in principle, to overcome the bias, and the machines can't. See, I'm a psychologist. I'm interested in precisely the things that I don't think a machine can do, which is, I teach refocusing, which is how to think about what to think about next, to get beyond the automatic. And that's exactly what a machine, essentially, almost by definition, cannot do, is get beyond the automatic. Yet that is essential to being objective. You are not objective automatically. For example, a simple example is what people do, and I don't know if the machines have the same tendency. They look for confirming evidence. It's just automatic to do so. But to be objective, you have to exert free will to look for counter evidence for the other side. And the machines don't have that ability, that free will ability. And that ability is not inherent in neurons as such. It's true that, I mean, it's not magical. I agree, but that's another thing I hear a lot, that I think what they mean, I don't know about you, Trent, but people usually mean it's not material or mechanistic. Well, in fact, if that's what you mean by magic, thinking is magic, because thinking is not a material, mechanistic process. It's emergent in John Searle's sense of emergent too. It's radically emergent. And I think that's necessarily the case. We don't know how it works, but it's not just a process of a material brain. There's something that emerges, and evolution found it somehow accidentally. Evolution doesn't find anything by purpose. It found it. We don't know how it works, but what we do know is it's not a physical process in the sense of current physics, because current physics is either deterministic or, as I said, indeterministic is even worse. Physical laws. Well, I'll stop there.
Okay, let me do these super chats.
Yeah. Well, great.
You're gonna lay all that out, and then we got to go to super chats.
Yeah. Okay. Why don't we let Trent go ahead, and then because Daniel wants us to leave actually a couple of minutes early, so we've got to compress this pretty well. So go ahead, Trent.
Okay.
Oh well.
Yeah, let Trent,
okay. In that case, I won't say too much about it. I think emergentism is something I could be convinced of. I mean, I'm sympathetic to it. I think it's a pretty big bullet to bite to say that you've got this, overtly physical system, the human brain, which gives rise to this emergent property, consciousness and free will, which allows us to reason objectively in a way that a machine never could, even though there's nothing at the level of a neuron that would lead you to believe that you couldn't do that in a machine. I mean, if I simulated your brain at a nanometer scale, and it was completely indistinguishable from what's happening inside your head, then I can't imagine why you wouldn't be just as conscious and have just as much free will, and you'd be a machine in a computer and that setup there. So, I mean, ignore whether or not we can do that now. We can't. I don't think that's too far away either. And you'd have to bite an awful big philosophical bullet to say even a nanometer scale, full bore, 100% high fidelity replication of your brain in a machine does not have the same properties.
No, I think that would probably, in a machine, that might have the same causal properties. I don't know. That might, but we're not anywhere even
that's
close
not so
to
far
that.
away. I'm not sure
that.
that's true. I'm not sure that's true.
Oh,
but we can do the super chats.
Yeah.
Okay. Discuss that in Clubhouse more. I want to hear.
Yeah. Okay.
Both of you on that. Okay.
Yeah, go ahead.
So super
Steve.
chat, Apollo Zeus for £2. No quick question. Thanks, Apollo. And Jamie Hernandez for 20 Mexican pesos, I believe.
All right.
And then we have a question from Enric Teller for $4.99.
Okay.
He says,
Rick, yeah.
synthetic life merged with technological AI could be the only way to reach AGI. Or that's a comment. But what,
He might be maybe, but why not just natural life plus AI? I think centaurs or maybe could already be considered to be artificially generally intelligent, and that will only get better. So I don't know why it has to be synthetic. Let me say, the Enric, it could, maybe if you could do synthetic, we knew how to do synthetic life that was conscious. We're back to that issue again. How do you do that? How do you create? We knew how to do that, well, that would be amazing. Yeah.
And we got Jonathan Honig in at the last second for $1.99. Thanks, Jonathan, for your support. And thanks for everybody for supporting the Ayn Rand Center UK and the Cutting Edge today. And are we going to follow up? We're going to meet in Clubhouse.
Do we have enough time for Trent to make a last statement before we go away?
Well, no, fantastic. I appreciate the second round invite. I very much enjoy going back and forth on these issues. I think all of the foundational objections you guys raised are very much worth answering. And so I believe that there's this entire frontier of worthwhile research to do in thinking about what free will is, what kinds of systems could give rise to it, what are the causal conditions required for it, whether a machine could ever have it, what's its relationship to intelligence. All of these things are very much worth asking. And so I love coming on here and debating them with you guys.
Great. That was great, Trent. Thanks a lot.
Yeah, and I would like to thank Trent for coming on, being such a great sport. And he takes these positions with conviction, and we definitely appreciate that, and we definitely want to have him back on.
Anytime.
And so until next time, we're going to be thinking about key concepts of this show, I think, are intelligence, free will, and consciousness. And until we get a definition, we won't ever get a definition of consciousness, but some closer, it's hard to contrast these things. So we're going to continue to discuss this over at Clubhouse, and we appreciate everybody for coming today.